Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Bicep community call of February 2023. It is in March. We see that. So we're going to have 2 community calls this month for each of the releases that are happening. So this is our team. Nothing has changed here. Our maintainers. Simon has recently joined as one of our core maintainers. I'm not sure, Simon, if you want to introduce yourself. He's been a huge help. He's been working on this for a few months, so sorry to just include you now.
No worries. Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm a consultant working in Sweden, and I've been using Bicep since the beginning and really happy with it.
Thanks, Simon. We're super happy to have you on our team as one of the maintainers. We love all our maintainers. They've been doing tremendous help for us. So thank you. Okay, what the community call is for, it's you guys, not for us. We want to share all of our topics, all of our release notes. So you have everything updated on a timely manner every single month. And if you can't make any of these calls, it will always be recorded. Please use the chat. We have the team here. Our engineers will always be checking the chat, answering questions. If you have any questions that you want to ask us directly, please raise your hand and we can call on you. Otherwise, at the end, we have a Q&A in which people can freely talk. But yeah, moving on to our O.15 release. Alex?
Okay. So the first is that the Kubernetes provider is publicly available. I should have shared details, or we should have shared details a little bit sooner than today, but you can now get started with this. You still need to opt in to the preview feature, but the quick start walks you through that. There's other documentation. Shenglong's going to present kind of the key scenarios that are enabled with the Kubernetes provider. So definitely very eager for folks to try that out. We don't think it's perfect yet, and so we want to get a sense of like what issues you guys are running into, etc. This number 2 kind of came out of nowhere. It was a very nice surprise. We now have support for Bicep in IntelliJ. So if you're a Java developer that also is using Bicep for their infrastructure deployments, the language server is now supported there as well. That was work done by one of the teams that works on Java in DevDiv. We get no credit for it, but wanted to share that and highlight it here. Number 3, Paste as Bicep. A lot of people have already been using that and getting a lot of value from it, so that's awesome to see. That was an experimental feature in the last O.14 release, and now it is enabled by default. So should be really easy to use that. Number 4, there's a new linter rule for using the parent property. So there's other ways to author child resources besides using the parent property. One that was a common pattern pre-Bicep was this like slash separated or slash segmented names, where the first segment was the parent and the second segment was the child. That prevents us from doing as much validation as we could. So we have a linter rule that kind of drives you into the pit of success on using the parent property for that use case. Number 5, we support view type definition now for modules from the public registry. So this is pretty nice, where if you are using one of those modules, you can just hover over it and click view type definition, and that will take you to the README for that module. We're building out support such that you can link documentation for any module in any registry, but we're starting with the public registry. So you'll see new arguments in the Bicep CLI for publishing with a new parameter for a documentation link. And this goes into the OCI manifest. There's a specific property for documentation. So this is a nice little feature that you can take advantage of. Number 6, nullable types. Jonny's going to walk through this in a little bit more detail. But if you've been using that like pattern where you check if a string is empty to kind of like do a pseudo optional parameter, this is a much nicer way of expressing that with less ceremony. So we'll talk through that. And number 7, there was a bug filed. I apologize, I forgot who filed it. But basically, if you were trying to use an anonymous container registry, we still checked if you were authenticated in some capacity, which was a mistake. That just slipped through. So now you can use an anonymous container registry without being authenticated in any capacity. So thank you for catching that bug. We were able to fix that pretty quickly.
We do have a question in chat. Is the Bicep for IntelliJ just for IntelliJ, or does it cover all of the JB IntelliJ based products like WebStorm or Writer?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer to it. We can certainly follow up offline to get you those details. And I don't know if PC, if you're here and you happen to know the answer to that one.
No, I do not know the answer to that one too, but we can follow up offline.
Okay, thank you. Another question, number 5, the documentation URI param for Bicep publish. Haven't found any docs on how that works.
Yes, it is that, and we should publish documentation. So we'll take a note to document that as well.
It's on my to-do, Alex.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, PC.
Thanks, PC. Okay, move on to future releases.
So for the next release, just a couple of things. One, we've talked about these CIDR math functions for calculating IP addresses. We're hoping those will make it into the 0.16 release. I think I forgot to update this slide. That should be 4.1, not 3.1. And then the completions for the public registry. So this should be really nice where when you start authoring a module, we'll prompt you to put in br/public, and then we'll give you IntelliSense on all the available modules and all the available versions. And the goal is to expand that out to the private registry as well. But again, it's a little bit easier to start with the public registry, so we'll kind of go from there. All the TBD columns are unchanged, although the Bicep parameters file is like well in progress, so that should land relatively soon. And the Microsoft Graph provider, we've made some decent headway through the design, and it seems like we're cranking away at that as well. So can't give an ETA for that, but we're making good progress for the graph provider for Bicep.
Well, thanks, Alex. Don't think there's any questions. So, Jonny, do you want to take over? Or I can also keep moving through the slides.
Could you do it? I don't have a copy of this slide deck open at the moment.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Okay. So one thing that we're introducing in 0.15 is a way to have a parameter be optional without supplying a default. So this is only going to be available if you have enabled the user-defined types experimental feature. But a common pattern that we've seen is this pattern on the left under the no sign. So if you have a string, you might say like, if the user doesn't supply it, make it an empty string. And if this is occurring in an orchestration template that's deploying a module where you want that module to be in charge of defining the default, if a user hasn't supplied that parameter, you need to do something like what's shown here, where you do a union of the parameters that you always have to set, and then you have to check storage account name and say, is it my custom emptiness sigil? If so, then don't set anything. Otherwise, set storage account name to storage account name. Anyway, there's a lot going on there, but what we introduced is what you see on the right-hand side, where if you append a question mark to any type symbol, that symbol becomes nullable. And if you do that for a parameter, that means that you don't supply a default for it because it has an implicit default of null. So this is mostly useful for these cases where you have one template that is deploying a bunch of modules and you want those modules to be responsible for setting defaults. So in this case, rather than having to do a union or check anything, you can just pass the nullable parameter directly through. If it hasn't been set by the caller, null will be passed through. If it has been set, then whatever was supplied will be passed through. The module, the nested template, won't distinguish between like, has this been set or has it been set to null? In both cases, the default will be used. Stephanie, could you advance? Stephanie, could you go to the next slide?
Stephanie, can you hear us? You're muted. I know she was saying she had some networking issues earlier today. But she also locked us out of moving the slides, so I may have to take over the presentation. Let's see here. Give me one sec.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I think something happened.
That's okay.
With my computer with Teams. Thanks, Alex.
I am recovering. Okay.
Okay, so one thing that I want to point out to anybody who's already using the user-defined types feature is that to reduce some confusion, nullable types come with a slight breaking change. So if you have been using optional properties, so these would be when you're defining an object, you can you previously could have a question mark that follows the property name, and that would say this property is not required. Instead, what you would do with Bicep 15 plus is you just mark the type as nullable. So in the example on the left, the my object type gets matched whether or not something has been supplied for optional int. And if you do want to supply a value for optional int, that property, you can either supply an integer or null. The other thing about this is that you may have run into this with the optional properties where in order to have like a fully recursive shape, you need one leg of that recursion path to be optional. That rule is still in effect, but now one leg along that path needs to be nullable. Alex, could you switch to the next slide?
Yep. And so effectively, Jonny, what I would change for optional properties is instead of putting the question mark after the property name, I'll put it after the type
Yes.
I'm selecting, right?
Exactly. It should be a fairly minimal change for any existing types that you have in your templates.
Cool.
Okay. A lot of text on this slide, but I wanted to call it because we are introducing these nullable types. There are some new operators that got added to Bicep to make working with nullable values a little easier. So you may have seen this in 0.14 because we started defining the return type for the first and last functions, and those return types are nullable. So one thing that we added in is a postfix exclamation point operator that says, you know, the value that preceded is not null. And this would be used if you're passing in a potentially null value to any target that expects a non-null value. If you don't have that exclamation point, it's not an error. Your template will still compile, but the Bicep compiler will warn you that that pass may fail at runtime. So the exclamation point is there to say, I know that in theory it could fail at runtime, but in this case it won't fail at runtime. So go ahead and suppress that warning. One thing that is coming out in 0.15 is a way to safely navigate nested properties, which can, if you don't know if the left-hand side of an operator is null or not, but you still want to navigate to a property of it, you can do so by sticking a question mark in front of the property name. So in this example that starts with param and object, the type of that parameter may be null because it's a nullable object that contains arbitrary keys whose value is a string. So the variable object property, this expression will never fail at runtime, but the value of object property may be null. This can be used with objects. The question mark just follows the dot operator in that case, or it can also be used with array syntax, where the question mark would be the first character within the square brackets. One thing to point out is this operator, it looks on sort of both sides of the of itself. So if the left-hand side is null, then it just goes ahead and short circuits returns null. But also if the right-hand side property is not present in the container, then that will just return null. So if in this last example, we have a similar situation where we have a parameter named an object that we know contains arbitrary keys whose value is a string. And in this case, we know that an object is non-null, but we don't know if it contains a given property. So this var prop statement, you would be able to do something like this in earlier versions of Bicep only by using the contains function to check if an object contained a property named property. But in this case, you would just use this safe navigation operator. And if property doesn't exist in object, then null will be returned. And like with the earlier case, this also works for arrays. Okay, I think I see some questions in the chat, which I can jump to, but I think that's it for my part of this presentation. So thank you, everybody.
Perfect. Do you want to answer the questions now, Jonny, or do you want to answer them in chat?
One that I saw go by that I did want to address, somebody asked, why is this dot question mark instead of question mark dot? And it's because it's a slightly different semantic from what you might be used to in TypeScript, because we're actually looking at whether the property exists in the object. In an ARM template, if you access a property, or if you try to access a property and that property doesn't exist, that's an error that will cause your deployment to fail. In TypeScript, JavaScript, that will just return you the value undefined. So here we're combining both the sort of null navigation that you're used to from TypeScript, and as well as baking in a contains function so that you can not have to do those runtime checks.
Any follow-ups to the explanation Jonny provided from anybody? Cool. Thanks, Jonny.
Sure. Thanks.
Shenglong?
Yeah, I guess I can take over. And let me start sharing. Can anyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. So hi everyone. So today I'm going to show you some demos for the Kubernetes provider. So the first thing that I'm going to show is to write some Kubernetes resources in Bicep from scratch. Like as Alex mentioned, we still consider the Kubernetes provider a preview feature or an experimental feature. So to use the Kubernetes provider, you do have to enable the settings in the Bicep config file. And to show you that, let me just create a Bicep config.json file for really quick. And then I'm gonna create an experimental features enabled section, and then I have to enable extensibility because the Kubernetes provider is an extensibility provider. It's not an Azure resource provider. So now that I have the bicep config.json file created, then I'm going to open my import demo.bicep file. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is the import statement. So to use resource to declare Kubernetes resources, I do have to import the Kubernetes provider. As soon as I type import space, you'll see that I get completions immediately. And in addition to the Kubernetes provider that I'm going to use, there's also AZ and sys. But it's worth mentioning that the AZ and the sys namespaces are always imported by default, so you don't have to import them manually. So once I select Kubernetes, it's going to tell me that, hey, it still requires some configurations. And the syntax that we use to provide configurations for the Kubernetes provider is a with keyword followed by an object to specify the configurations. So one of my favorite features about that I like about the Bicep extension is the required properties completion. And we also implemented that for the provider configurations. So I'm going to just select that. And then it will ask me to provide the kubectl, which is a base64 encoded string. This is basically the connection string to the Kubernetes cluster that I'm going to connect. So for now, I'm going to create a parameter. Config type must be a string. And since this is a connect string, I want to annotate it with a secure decorator. And the second configuration that I'm going to provide is the namespace that I'm going to deploy the resource to. And in this case, I'm going to do default. So, okay, now that I have my Kubernetes provider imported and configured, I can finally create some Kubernetes resources. And here, as we can see, in addition to the regular Azure resources completions, I get the completions for different Kubernetes resource types, for example, apps/deployment. And the scheme of the resource type is very similar to the Azure resources. So you will have the resource type group followed by the specific resource type, and we use the @ to denote the to separate the resource type and the API version. And again, as you can see, I also get the required properties completion. I can just hit enter, and it will just populate all the required properties for me. And in this case, I can just type. I can just specify metadata.name my app, and I also have completions for other properties. And another nice thing about authoring Kubernetes resources in Bicep instead of YAML is that you get type checking, of course. So if I change the metadata name to some integer, I will get a warning, just like other Azure resources. So the Kubernetes resource types are generated from the Kubernetes API spec, aka the Kubernetes Swagger definitions. There might be some like inaccuracy, but overall, I think it's so far based on my testing, it's still it's pretty usable. So if you find any like issues, feel free to open an issue. Let me see if there are any questions so far. Okay, cool. Oh, there's one question. Do the Kubernetes provider generate resource work with private clusters? Yes, it works with any clusters in theory. Because all it needs is a kubectl string. And there's another question: what VSC theme are you using? Well, I believe I answered that question in a previous community call, but the theme that I'm using is called Azure. This one. It's one of my favorite. Okay, cool. I think that covers the first scenario, which is the import statement and the Kubernetes resources. So the second thing.
Sorry, Shenglong, you have a hand up. Garo, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question about the private clusters. So we have private AKS clusters that are on subnets. So how does this, when you run this, how does it execute, and how does it execute on the network to get to the cluster?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Well, in that case, I'm not sure if we will be able to deploy, because it's the Kubernetes resources will be deployed by Kubernetes, by like an extension host that's running inside Azure. So I think that might be one limitation that we'll have to get around in the future. So but feel free to create an issue, and I think that's something we can consider adding support for.
And yeah, Garo, if you are able to try it out and just confirm our suspicions that it doesn't work, that would be tremendously helpful. If you can't, obviously, no worries. We can try it out too.
And
yeah, sure.
For what it's worth, the requests to the Kubernetes cluster should come from the ARM service tag. But we'll have to investigate as well. This will work.
And there's another question: does it pass back hints from the YAML, like please move from /beta v1 to v/v1? The answer is no. Currently, the only checks that we do is type checking, and it doesn't leverage like hint from the YAML file. But that's definitely something we can improve in the future.
Andreas, do you happen to know the source of that information that kubectl uses to make those suggestions? We can discuss it in chat, but if we had a source of truth, that would be the first step to lighting up some of that behavior, if it's not codified in their API specifications.
Yeah, I guess we can continue the discussion offline. Let me continue. So the second scenario that I would like to show off is to convert an existing Kubernetes manifest to a Bicep file, and then deploy that Bicep file through the regular AZ deploy commandlet, instead of having to run kubectl apply. So here I have a sample Kubernetes manifest that I copied from some AKS quick start tutorial. And in this manifest, I have 4 Kubernetes resources, a backend service, which is just a Redis service. A backend app, which is just a Redis app, and the backend service that exposes the Redis app, and then a front end website, a sample web app called Azure Vault Front, and finally a load balancer for the website. Like I said, traditionally to deploy this, let's say I want to deploy this manifest to some AKS cluster, I will have to get the credential, basically get the kubectl of the AKS cluster using AZ AKS get credentials, and then save the kubectl to a local file, and then use kubectl to connect to that cluster, and then I finally run kubectl apply. But with the Kubernetes provider, what you can do today is to use an experimental command called Bicep import Kubernetes manifest. Here, as you can see, I just summoned the VS Code command palette, and I just type Bicep import Kubernetes manifest, select that, and then you are prompted to ask me to select a YAML file. here I'll just select Azure vault.yaml. And then within 1 second, it will just create this Bicep file for me. At the top, as you can see, this is the import statement that I just showed, and it also creates a parameter kubectl for me automatically. And if you take a look, at the resources, let me show this side by side with the YAML file. You'll find the resource definitions very similar to the resource definitions in the YAML file. So yeah. So next, instead of doing kubectl apply, like I mentioned, I can just deploy this. Oh, by the way, there's one thing I forgot to show. There's one thing I need to change. So before I joined the meeting, I created a sample, created a test AKS cluster in my test environment called KS provider demo cluster. So the next thing I'm going to do is to reference the existing AKS cluster in the main.bicep file. And then I need to, let's say that I want to deploy all the Azure Vault apps and services. The next thing I'm going to do is to create a module in my main.bicep file. Just call it Azure Vault. And then I'm going to reference my Azure-vault.bicep file. Again, I will just select required properties. Give it the name Azure Vault. And here I'll need to supply the kubectl for my AKS cluster. So what I'm going to do is to just do AKS cluster.list cluster admin credential and the kubectl. I want to use the first one, value. So okay, now I've hooked up the AKS cluster with my Azure Vault module. Now finally, what I can do is to deploy this main.bicep file to my test resource group. I'll just run the AZ deployment group create command, hit enter, and because I have already deployed the template beforehand, so it should only take like 10 seconds to complete. Now to save us some time, I'll just go to my test cluster, navigate to services and ingresses. And here you will find the two services that I declared in my Azure Vault Bicep file. There's my backend service, and there's this front-end load balancer. And if I open the external API, it will take you to the website that I just deployed. Okay, I think that covers my demo for today. And
Awesome.
I'll hand it over back to Alex.
Stephanie, do you want me to keep presenting, or do you want to take back over?
Yeah, I could take it back over. Hopefully nothing bad happens again.
Shenglong, there's one question from Oeni. Is it possible to pass the kube config securely from one module to another? The scenario I'm thinking of is a main.bicep file, which has cluster creation, and then a cluster configuration module using Kubernetes provider. And I think what we would recommend in that case is to basically reestablish the reference to the Kubernetes cluster in main.bicep, you would want to reestablish the reference to the cluster with existing, and then get the kubeconfig value at that point and pass it into the other module.
Yeah, I would like to second that, because currently there's no secure output in ARM template or Bicep files. So in theory, yes, you can just output the kubeconfig string as a regular string, but that's not a best practice. So yeah.
There's another question about the credentials that you need to talk to the cluster. Jan asked, would this only work with cluster admin credential, or are you planning to support a lesser privileged deployment scenario as well? And I don't think this is up to us, right, Shenglong? This is based on what Kubernetes, the AKS allows?
Yes, this is up to the AKS cluster and your configuration, I think. I don't think it only works with admin credential. Like if you have your if you have a specific RBAC control, then I mean it should work with other credentials in theory. On the backend, we're just using the Kubernetes SDK to talk to the cluster. So anything that works with the Kubernetes API and Kubernetes SDK should work.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point that Shenglong just brought up. We treat this as a very thin abstraction, just like we do our abstraction of Azure types. We don't really want to get in the way or do anything special. So if it works in the Kubernetes layer, it should work in the Bicep layer too. Andreas asked if it works with managed identities in a CI/CD pipeline.
That I'm not 100% sure. So maybe Marcy and Anthony can help answer that question. Well, as long as you can get the kube config, I think you should be able to do that. I don't know if you can just if you can list credentials with a managed identity.
I think you would be able to, as if the managed identity is authorized to do it.
Yeah, I think the challenge at the moment there would be, so the way that works is that like the Kubernetes tooling provides support for OAuth, but how would you generate a kube config like within the command itself? So normally you like the tooling will actually generate a kube config, but with an OAuth token from talking to Azure AD. So at the moment, like you can't actually call the resource to get that specifically, right? Because it's going to be on your context or the context of the managed identities. So there would need to be another way to generate that base 64 encoded string as the kube config with the with a OAuth token in it and the other configuration details, which I don't know, possibly you could do, but might be a bit difficult.
Got it. So in that case, I think it would be worth opening an issue for us to see if there's something that we could improve either on the Bicep side or in terms of like available functions, or if it's something that we could potentially forward to the AKS team.
And by the way, for Kubernetes provider related issues, feel free to open an issue against the Bicep-extensibility repo. It's not the same Bicep main repo. I just dropped the link in the chat.
Okay, let's move on from this topic. I think we have a few more that we want to address in this call. So if you
sorry, Stephanie.
No, all good. All good.
Before I go, you have some documentations that we just published. I also copy and paste the links in the chat window. So the demo that I showed today, you can follow. You can do the same by following the quick start tutorial, which is the last link. Yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. PC?
Sure, yeah. Let me share my, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, awesome. Okay, I am doing the demo today, but the person who worked on this is actually Bhavya. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us. So if you like what you see, right, thank Bhavya, but if you don't like it, you can blame me. All right, so this is for the Bicep registry reference completions. It is actually going to be shipped in .15, but behind an extra experimental flag. We know that folks are actually eagerly waiting for this, and we want to get feedback. So the first thing you do is go to settings, make sure that you will see a new checkbox here that says experimental. enable module registry reference completion. Make sure that you have that checked. All right. Now going back to the Bicep file, let's just take a look at how things will work. Let's just say that I want to reference a module. I go module test, and then as you can see, let's do without alias first. Okay. So with this, the autocomplete will come out. I have two choices because I have the first one is actually the public registry, while the second one is actually a registry that I have access to. Okay. Now, but what if you are going to doing some experiment and then you want to list all the public registry that you have access to, like, I mean, sorry, the private registry that you want to access to, right? So you can go back to settings, and that is another checkbox that you can check, and it will include all the private registry that you have access to, and I can show you how it works. If I go back here, and it's taking some time to load. Now that is because, as you can see, it's listing everything that you have access to. Okay. Now, not all private registry have modules in there. That's why we have that option for you to honor what you have in your Bicep config. And it's because initially, without that second box checked, I have configured that in my Bicep config.json. That's why, you know, I have only two choices in the autocomplete when I have the second box unchecked. Okay, so let's go ahead and select the public registry. You can see all the modules in there are listed. Okay, pick the first one and the version. We will get this. So we will get. I have found a bug. We are going to list the most recent version first, so you can pick that version. It will be auto completed and required properties, and there you go. Nice. Yeah, right. Now, Alex mentioned view type earlier. If I mouse over test and click view type, because it's a public registry, the README is actually showed immediately pop up in a browser. Okay. So what if similarly for it works similarly for with alias. So I can do a test2, and then with BR, as you can see, the two public and ACD will be listed. Okay, at this point, I'm going to share a bit of a bad news. The private registry support is partial. We can pull out the endpoint for the private registry, but beyond that, the path and version and everything, you will have to type. But the support is coming in the next few months, so we are working on it. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, cool. Thanks, PC. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. We have a really exciting update from Bernie White. He's going to give us an update on
Can I jump in
PS.
real fast with a question on that last one?
Oh, sure, please. Sorry, I
Can
didn't see it.
can the list of all the registries that are shown be filtered by subscription instead of just all or a very few?
Good question. We need to test it out. I'm not very sure. Marcin, do you know the answer to that?
I think we should be able to add that in. Like I think we have the information, so or we can make the necessary calls to get the information to get like a subscription name or a subscription ID. But like, which parts would you be interested in the most?
I mean, really, I guess my biggest concern would be if I have, I have access to customers' subscriptions, and I may not want to accidentally invoke tooling from their subscriptions that I intend to use with someone else, for example.
Got it. So would you want to see like the subscription name or the subscription ID?
Either one would be nice, but if I had to only pick one, let's say probably the name. Okay.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Yeah, it's definitely something we could look into and add, because we should have all the necessary information, and we either have the information or we have enough to actually make the calls to get it. So we should be able to do it. Can you open an issue to track this? on the in the GitHub repo and in the Bicep repo?
Okay, everything okay with that one? We'll address offline. All right. Bernie, please take over.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so hopefully you can all hear me. With the latest versions to PSRule for Azure, we added some additional Bicep support. So in 1.24, which you can access now, we added Lambda support, which is desired by the community. So that one's good to go. In the latest 1.25, we are also adding support for ToObject as well, which was dropped in the latest or one of the latest releases of Bicep, as well as custom type support. We also have been getting a number of issues just in terms of people understanding within their CI pipelines when they're running tests what Bicep CLI they have installed. So sometimes it can be confusing because often the Bicep CLI is installed, but also then the Bicep CLI is also installed via the AZ CLI. So we've also added basically a version check, which will then output within the pipeline what version of Bicep that you're using. This does need to be optionally enabled, so definitely check out the docs in the release notes for how to actually do that, and we'll be interested in the feedback for sure. And also, so I guess one of the things that we've been working on and continue to working on into the future, which was also dropped in 1.24, was some improvements to policy as rules, which is the feature that then allows us to then convert policy to rules that then you can enforce within your CI process. So basically allowing you to then obviously see what's going to happen from an Azure policy perspective within VS Code and tooling. So with the latest release of 1.24, there's 350 pre-built rules that are ready to go, plus you can go ahead and add your own as well. So I'm going to do a quick demo of some of the like more specific things that are not actually in this notes, but that then is worthwhile knowing, particularly if you're building out your Bicep modules in terms of how you can use PSRule for testing. So let me just take control, if that's okay, Stephanie.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And cool. So I'm just in a repo at the moment. I'll share a link to the quick start repo at the end of the call. But this is just a repo that I've cloned from the quick start option, and I have pretty well just added a few additional things in there. So if I go into my Bicep module, I've got a PSRule extension installed, which allows me to basically go to terminal run task and then run analysis of my code. So I can go ahead and check my my modules. And so if I was to go ahead and wait for this to run, but let's go ahead and maybe change something like go down to our storage account and then go ahead and change our minimum TLS version to something different. So we'll wait for that to complete. But so basically what we're doing is we're trying to work out with the testing in PSRule, do we have secure configurations and things like that? So really this sort of goes, and enhances what the Bicep linter already supports. So the Bicep linter is going to provide awesome support for syntax and definitely some of the common security issues that we see within Bicep code or templates. But then we can then go ahead and layer on some additional rules that will then check against the well-architected framework. So obviously using TLS1 might be an issue. So if we go ahead and run analysis on that now, and so you'll sort of see that I'm actually using from my deployed the Bicep, I'm calling through to my storage module. And so even though my parameter file is fine here, and I could also make some additional changes here to then break things here as well. And these are just examples in the quick start repo, that then it's going to call out the fact that, hey, right down here somewhere, I've got my TLS version set to an insecure version. So that's really what it's designed to do. And so if we go ahead and have a look at how can we do that with tests, this would be another example. Let's just scroll up there. So you can sort of see there now, because I've made that change, it's actually called out multiple instances of where, you know, anything that might be inheriting from this main.bicep is basically now potentially insecure, and maybe I need to go ahead and check out the link to see how I can fix that. But also it's also calling out that, you know, it's set to this, right? Cool. So we've got our Bicep deployment there. If we go ahead and have a look at our Bicep tests, again, we could use this to test different code paths as well from a unit testing perspective. So that's one thing that you can definitely do. In terms of, let me just revert back that change. I've also gone and added some custom rules as well. So even though we've got these built-in rules, 350 built-in rules, you can also go ahead and add your own rules as well, right? And so this would be an example of one of the rules that you might have. So I've got a few here. I've got a rule to go ahead and check, you know, tags to make sure the resources are tagged. Even also to check within the what path it's in. So I guess a common pattern that we might see in customers is they may be using something like code owners within GitHub, right? Code owners to then make sure that then any files that maybe are in a specific path. So maybe I have a specific path such as under my deployments configuration, there is a specific path that maybe controls like secure policy or something like that. So where those files are then located becomes important, because if I move the files to a different path, then maybe there's a different team that are approving those things, right? And so with something like this, we can actually go ahead and analyze the configuration, work out what resources are in the files or would be deployed from that location, and then also then enforce that then they're actually in a certain folder structure, so that then you know, people can't shift them around, and then avoid like controls like code ownership. A second and third option here as well is that maybe we also require certain metadata. So in this particular case here, I'm actually checking the Azure deployment. And then, so this is just a little bit of a pre-check to make sure I don't also do ARM templates, which I also have in here as well. But then I can go ahead and check to see if my modules have a metadata name in them. So if I go back to my storage module here, I've got some metadata at the end here, which I then use for generating documentation. So if I go ahead and don't have that in place, then it will then basically generate an error, right? Or generate a rule failure. And same thing for description. So I've got a module that I pre-built to save a little bit of time in my add failures branch. So you can sort of see here now I've got this Azure Container Registry module. And so I've also got some additional checks for things like README as well, to make sure that file exists, and also to make sure my test file exists. So in this case here, I've got tests, but I don't have any README, and my main doesn't have any metadata. So let's just go ahead and let's just double check and make sure I've got that enabled. So for that, we use a feature within PSRule called conventions, which basically allows us at a high level to go ahead and add and like extend PSRule. So it's sort of like it's basically like a hooking mechanism within PSRule, which basically then allows us to then, in this particular case here, I've just got a bit of PowerShell code, which then allows us to read the directory structure, work out what are modules, and then work out that then there should be certain files within those modules by basically checking, make sure there's a test file and make sure there's a README file. So if I go ahead now and run that, it's going to sort of flag, except just need to enable that convention. Let me just go ahead and do that. Cool. And while that runs, let's just go ahead and just talk through those rules quickly as well. So again, these are so what's happening here with the convention is I'm going and using PowerShell to go ahead and scan the directory path and find any main.bicep files. And then effectively, I'm just going and working out that within my structure, the first folder under modules here is the name of the module, and then the V1 is the version. And so I'm just basically populating that as an object, which then I can analyze later. So basically with that type. And then down here, I'm picking up that type, looking for that, and then using that to check relative to that path, is there a test.main.bicep or is there a README? And you can sort of see there, as a result, we get a number of different failures, such as, this ACR module doesn't actually have a README, and it's going to call that out. Same as the module name, the module description metadata isn't set. And also we've picked up, again, some of the built-in rules. So within my Azure Container Registry module, I've also got the admin user enabled, which is sort of like the local administrator account, which isn't very secure for the container registry. So again, that's enabled. And also then, content trust is also not enabled, which is a recommended practice to have content trust enabled and to also sign things like containers, although that's not supported maybe for Bicep at the moment. In terms of general, best practice, then that would be something that we'd flag. If we sort of said, hey, well, this is for Bicep, we can't actually enable that, or enabling that doesn't really make any sense, we can go into our PSRule configuration to add a suppression as one way that we would do that. So to do that, we basically just go ahead and grab the name of the rule. Oops. And then we would just identify the thing that failed. So let's just go ahead and find the thing that failed was this container registry. So we suppress it by name. And then we can just add that as an element within there. That's one way we can do suppression anyway, but that's an easy way to do it. And then when we go ahead and run it, that specific rule won't reappear. So that's pretty well most of my demo. Is there any questions that we have? Just double check the chat.
You do have quite a few questions, Bernie, but because we're at time, if it's okay, can you respond in chat?
Yep, I will do that. Awesome.
And
Thank
then
you so
maybe
much.
if I guess there's a link already here to your repo, but it might be good to put a link here if people want to open up issues or anything like that or ask more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of links in the chat. I think also some people have posted them as well. But if you like what you sort of see, feel free to also reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. We do have updates that come out. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bernie.
Thank you so much, Bernie. We have a couple questions, but please put them in chat, and Bernie can answer them in chat. We have one update that was requested. Alex,
Yeah, so this was the last call we had. We had a long conversation about this check if resource exists issue, and there's also a retry issue that's kind of related for these cases where RPs are not idempotent, or there's a host of reasons why you would need something like this today. The update, and I put an update in the GitHub issues as well, is basically that we would like to, try to take another run at this and get kind of approval to do these sorts of things. What we want to do is, if we are blessed to implement it, to have some semantic way of tying your use of these features to the resource type where it's relevant and necessary. So if you're using check if resource exists for key vault secrets was one of the examples in that thread. If a large number of people are doing that, it would suggest maybe the API should be revisited or redesigned or some of those things. So it would be a means for us to collect relevant telemetry for making better decisions in the future. So that's what we would kind of need to be able to do in order to implement some of these things, in addition to kind of getting this approval to change our stance on it. So I'm just giving this update because I said I would give this update in the last call. So we are having conversations about it, and we'll keep you posted as these discussions continue.
All right, sounds good. We're at questions and answers, but we are at time. Are there any pressing questions anyone wants to ask that might just take a minute or so? Otherwise, we can always talk about them next call, or you could create an issue on Bicep. All right, sounds good. Thank you everyone for coming. Super excited to have this call every month. We will have another one in about 3 or 4 weeks, and I will send that invite out about 1 or 2 weeks before. Thanks everyone.